Hi, this is Jim Cunningham. It is time to rethink your retirement strategy. Hi, this is Jim Cunningham. I've got Shannon, Beahan, and Alissa Kroeger with me. Today, we're going to talk about rethinking your retirement strategy. Well, what happens if you have more income? Well, actually, you do have higher income in retirement, don't you? A lot of times, right? Higher required minimum distributions from retirement accounts. Income taxes, shockingly, Shannon and Alissa, our clients are stunned that they actually pay more income taxes in retirement than they did while they were working. Higher capital gains taxes. And if you happen to live in the beautiful state of California, there is no capital gains tax. It's all straight income up to 13.3% on top of everything else you pay, increased Medicare expenses. And we're going to look at what types of assets are best suited for which types of accounts, because what's in your retirement account, right, Shannon and Alissa? You may not want that in your account that's in your name versus a retirement account. And how can required minimum distributions affect your future income? So I'm Jim Cunningham. I'm a partner at CunninghamLegal. I have over 25 years experience. We have offices in California. I'm a certified specialist in estate planning, trust and probate law, real estate broker, securities and insurance licensed, and a pilot. These are the lawyers at our firm currently. We'll be adding a couple of more in next to a week or so. And we've got Alissa and Shannon. They're with Ascent Wealth Management, and John and Christina are their partners. They are not here. And you guys this is some pretty significant brain power. And I will tell you, you guys are like all women at your firm, right? This is fantastic. You don't see that very much, do you?
No, very unique
Yeah.
case. Yeah.
All right. So disclaimer, we're going to talk. I've been doing all the talking. I promise I'll let you guys talk. I'm a lawyer. I'm not dispensing legal advice. This is information. And Shannon and Alissa are dispensing information. This is not to be construed as legal or financial advice. And we were talking a little bit before we got started. This is a real mindset shift from working and building wealth. And then you hit that peak, and then you're not building wealth anymore. And you have this sort of change in your lifestyle, right? And your life, you become essentially retired. And then you go in the distribution phase. I will tee that up, and Shannon and Alissa, I will let you take it from here.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think this is really something that, from our perspective, is so important for us to touch on, because for the clients that we're dealing with, it's often one of the biggest hurdles in their financial life. I think it's interesting, Jim, you use the word peak when you're kind of introducing this concept, because one of the analogies I like to use about this transition is like climbing a mountain, like mountaineering. Oftentimes, what's in your mind is that ascent and getting up to the top, planting that flag, taking the photo at the top. But oftentimes when you look at when things go wrong in mountaineering, 9 times out of 10, it's on the descent. You've made it to the top, you've reached your goal, that adrenaline's coming down, you're tired from the long journey, but you're really only halfway there. So you've got to make sure that you're intentional and careful on the way back down as well. There's this very distinct, in my opinion, difference between the accumulation mindset and the distribution mindset. And so often we find that we spend so many of our working years in that accumulation mindset that when we get to distribution, it's really a hard switch to flip, and we kind of get stuck in that accumulation phase or that accumulation mindset. And I think that our goal for today is really to talk about what are the differences, what really makes that distribution phase significantly different than the first phase, and how do we handle that? I think that there's always risks in investing, which, if you've spent any time talking to any financial advisor, you've talked about risk. But there's some risks that are unique or specifically more acute in the distribution phase that we want to talk about. And what, from my perspective, I think kind of the biggest 2 components that make these phases so different is, first, accumulation, you really have a lot of control in when that phase ends and when you flip the switch. Distribution, the timeline on that one is a little bit more gray, right? We don't know how long we're going to spend in retirement. And the goals there are also then a little bit different as well. The goal on accumulation is just get that nest egg as big as possible. goal on distribution is how do we crack that nest egg to make sure that we don't outlive our money, so that we meet our goals in terms of, our legacy. How do we even know when we can flip that switch to distribution?
Anonymous has a great question, and I think this is really a great beginning question. Anonymous asks, we are looking to invest profits from a home. We would like to have an income. What are our options? I think this correctly describes the shift in mindset, right? It's, I'm working, I'm meeting my basic needs, I'm putting away money every month, whatever it is. Then you stop working and now you got to draw down. And so really that is, I think, the fundamental question is, you need a source of money to live on because Social Security is not enough. You have to pay taxes. You got to do all this stuff. That money has to come from somewhere. And we're kind of living in a scary time, where you have a couple of bank failures. And I would be really nervous right now if I were retiring and unsure. There's a lot of information out there in the world, not a lot of insight, unfortunately, a lot of information, a lot of scare tactics, and a lot of people, selling a lot of things that may or may not be appropriate for a client. So great question, Anonymous. We're going to answer that as we go through the materials here.
Yeah, certainly will. So I think the grounding area for this discussion is really risks and managing those risks. So there are investment risks or specific risks that are always going to be there in any situation, in accumulation and distribution. We actually did previously with you, Jim, a whole webinar talking about these risks. So we won't go into too much detail about these here today, but I don't think these are things that are going to surprise anyone that's tuning in today. Inflation, obviously, you can't hardly open your eyes in the morning without hearing something on the news or in the newspaper about inflation these days. And it's just going to continue to be a compounding issue, especially when it comes to things like healthcare, which tend to inflate at higher rates than our other living expenses just in general. So that's something that really sneaks up on a lot of people. Important to build that into your financial projections and planning moving forward. Investment risk is simply kind of market risk. There's always going to be ups and downs, volatility. I think I speak for Alissa as well when I say that we would expect this to be a continued issue moving forward, at least in the near term, with some choppiness in the market. To your point, Jim, I think it's got a lot of people a little bit anxious and nervous, and that's something that's going to be there in terms of a risk that's manageable. But we've got to just be strategic about it. Things like liquidity risk. If you make specific investments that aren't, there's not a market for them for you to exit, or there's going to be consequences from a tax perspective when you exit those, that's always a risk in investing. And I always like to include this last one here, behavioral, which I think is something a lot of time as investors, we don't necessarily want to own, but it is something that can be very impactful on the portfolio and your overall financial plan is making the wrong decision at the wrong time. And it's always going to be at play in any phase, but it's something to consider for sure.
We have another question here from Steve. Steve says, why distribute what I've worked so hard to get? Why not make more now? I get more in Social Security than I did in wages. So I can take more, but reasonable risk with my investments. And I think Alissa and Shannon, you would agree that, there's no right or wrong answer. It is what is appropriate for an individual person, which it's kind of frustrating to me as a lawyer, as a practitioner. And so what I mean by practitioner is there's theoretical, and then there's the practical everyday application of these concepts to people, your clients, that have really meaningful outcomes, positive or negative. And I think it's the importance of having an individualized approach. I don't think there's one, you can maybe do categories, but really every situation's different. And
and so much of what we'll talk about today, it exhibits that, Jim. It's really a domino effect. If you pull one lever, it can change things down the road, whether that's immediately or whether that's 10, 15 years down the road. So you really have to be careful and cognizant of how one change impacts the overall plan. In thinking about that transition from accumulation to distribution, there's a couple of risks that we want to focus on today, because these are the risks that are very specific to this phase where we are starting to take the distributions. Sequence of returns risk, we're going to come back to in just a second, because I think that's one that is unique enough that it kind of warrants some visuals on its own. Some of the other risks that we think about, which This to me is the primary one that stands out when we talk about retirement is longevity risk. Am I going to outlive my money? Do I have enough saved? This risk is also very unique in that it becomes more acute with age, right? So a guy in decent health today, a male could, if he's 65 years old, he could expect to live reasonably another 20 years or so. Once he's 80, he has over a 50-50 shot of living into his 90s and a pretty decent shot of living past 100. And for females, that's even a greater, I'm going to call it a risk, but it's not necessarily. This is one of those unique ones because you want your life to be long and healthy, but it is a risk when it comes to the portfolio, right?
Yeah, I mean, really the flip side of this, I happen to have a birthday, which that number will remain between us. I have a birthday this month. And I think when birthdays come around, you think about these things, right? I think it's human. And the flip side of this is we have a lot of clients who, work hard, retire. We have a mutual client I'm thinking of who passed away and, 70, 71 years old. And like, you look at that and you think, gosh darn it, well, maybe it's okay to retire at 55 if you're not going to make it past that age. But you don't know, right? God knows, we don't know. It's like, who knows? But it's something that I think sometimes people undervalue the longevity risk. They don't really think about it as a risk, right? It's kind of a net positive. It's really outliving your money.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's also, there's this impact of the timeline, right? So, and we see this when people are deciding about, making the switch and retiring, is that when there's an extended time period, which is why accumulation is easier than distribution, you're saving money. And in your head, you're thinking, I'm not going to touch this for years and years and years out into the future. So you're not as worried about it. And I think the same thing happens with longevity, not to mention that, death and passing isn't necessarily something that people are comfortable dealing with. So I think there's this tendency to just kick the can down the road a little bit. But there's some really interesting planning that we can do if we take the time to be cognizant in making those choices. Tax risk is something that I want to make sure that we touch on, because this one is, it's always present. It's present in accumulation. You're always paying taxes, but it becomes more significant in retirement and also less controllable. You've got things start to, like you mentioned earlier, Jim, you've got RMDs that start kicking off. You've got your Social Security. If there's pension that's coming out to you, you don't have quite as much control over the timing of those income streams as you've got earlier in life. And so that tax risk becomes even more important that we're focusing on it, because the ways that we can control it become smaller and smaller. And then last one I've got listed here is spending risk. This is, of course, normal living expenses. And as financial advisors, one of the kind of curveball events that we talk to clients about is a long-term care event, which can cause a spike in spending, which is something that, we can insure against. But oftentimes we forget about some of the other things that could happen, whether that's a family crisis where someone's in need, whether that's a natural disaster, or even something like a divorce. There's this trend of, if you Google silver divorce, there's a lot of stories about people in the very early years of retirement going through some sort of event that very much changes their financial plan moving forward. So those are risks that we need to think about. We need to think about, hey, if something like this were to happen, how would I handle it? Is my plan robust enough to recover?
Yeah, we have a question here, kind of a related question. And part of this is this accumulation versus distribution. We're talking about retirement. One of the patterns that I'm seeing emerge is that many times when people inherit money, they're essentially inheriting their retirement. So mom and dad have worked hard. The kids maybe haven't saved as much. And so that inheritance at age 60 or whatever it might be is the source of funding for retirement. So this is a related question. This is really important because it goes to tax law. The question was emailed in regarding an inherited IRA with beneficiary being a see-through trust. Now, this is a technical question having to do with when you inherit an IRA. Typically, it either goes to a human being or it goes to a specific type of trust that allows you to take distributions out over a longer period of time. Instead of taking $1 million in one tax year, you're taking it out over 5 tax years or 10 tax years. So the question is, we're receiving conflicting advice. A state attorney says the trust is see-through and qualifies for the 10-year rule. The brokerage house that holds the inherited IRA insists that the IRS has not clarified this ruling, which they have, and they're reporting the RMD as being under the 5-year rule. If we follow the RMD according to the brokerage report, this will have devastating tax consequences for both the trust and individual beneficiaries. Seeking your opinion. Let me tell you something. This is how the real world is. This is going to be shocking. Not every brokerage firm is following the law. Let me say that again. Not every brokerage firm is following the law as it's written, because it's very confusing. It takes a long time to implement these processes. And it's only fairly recently, that the Internal Revenue Service has come out with clear guidelines. So in that case, I would say certainly reach out to our firm. You could certainly reach out to Shannon and Alissa. You may have the potential of doing a trustee to trustee transfer. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Shannon and Alissa, what that is, or if that's like way off base, but there may be a way to basically go to a different firm, but you can't take the money out. This is really important. You would have to set up a new account and then move that money from the trustee of that IRA to the trustee at the different institution. Any thoughts on that, Shannon or Alissa?
I think for me, this is why, if you've ever, if you're a longtime watcher of these webinars, you'll have heard us say before, it's so important that you have a team on your side and that team is communicating with each other, because so often what we see is, these brokerage houses, their advisors oftentimes are employees, and they may just be, getting guidance from the brokerage house itself, or may not even be familiar with a certain concept. So we've seen instances before where a client has put together a great estate plan, done a lot of work, laying out what their wishes are and how they want things to go. And then the brokerage firm just simply doesn't know how to execute it, and mistakes are made. And then, unfortunately, client's not here to see it, or maybe fortunately client isn't here to see it, but things just don't go the way that a client intended. So it is really important that you're working with an advisor who has a broad knowledge of, estate planning, investment planning, retirement planning. All of us here at Ascent Wealth Management are certified financial planners, so we're all versed in all of those areas, and making sure that, estate plan on one side is talking to investment firm on the other side to make sure that these questions are answered.
Yeah, and that's got to be really stressful. I mean, but I would reach out to Shannon or Alissa on that one. All right, let's talk about sequence of returns. This is a great. I've been an attorney for almost 30 years. It's when you hit 25, you're like, yeah, I'm kind of done with that. I started practicing in 1994. I've been through a lot of these cycles where there were really, good years and bad years. And when you retire, like assuming you go all in, you can have really different outcomes. It's really amazing. So same people, years after, one person's going to have a completely, better, different outcome than, the other person. So take it away with David.
Yeah. So sequence of returns is something that most people haven't even thought about. It's a unique concept in the sense of I have X and I should be able to spend, a certain amount per year and be fine with that. And so does, because Rosie down the street's been able to do that. Well, difference is when you retire and when you experience specific returns in early retirement or late retirement, and kind of the sequence of when you experience those. That's the whole concept, sequence of returns. So this concept, or this example here, is David. He retired at the end of 1994. He had invested $250,000. And he began taking what we would think is a reasonable withdrawal, around 5%. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the old 4% withdrawal rate rule. It's possibly 3 now, depending on who you talk to with regards to inflation. But this is just for purposes of this. It's a 5% withdrawal at a $12,500 per year spend. And in the early phases of his retirement, you see, these are the real returns from 1995 all the way through 2014. And you'll see 2008, which is, in there glaring at you. But he experienced really great, strong double-digit rates of returns in his early years in retirement, and that boosted his portfolio. So 5% on when the market's doing 37%, you're keeping the rest in your portfolio, and that's going to continue to compound over that lifespan in retirement. On the flip side of that, and then at the end of the year, or at the end of his 20-year term in retirement, he's got about $1 million, or a little over $1 million, starting at 250, and he's been able to spend along the way. That's the value of having strong rates of return in the beginning part of your retirement, because you're keeping that arbitrage, the differential between what you're pulling out and what the market's giving you. On the flip side of that, we have the next scenario. Can we skip to the next slide? There we go. And then we have Monica, who retired at the end of 1999. So just a 4-year difference or 5-year difference on when she retired. Same amount of money in the bank, same spend at 5%, but you'll see she's now entering into retirement with a sequence of negative returns in those early years. And what that does is it has actually a compounding negative impact on your portfolio. So if you're pulling out 5 and the market's down 9-10%, you're really down, 15% in your portfolio after 1 year of retirement. And you're like, I'm not spending that much, but the market's taking it from you essentially. And that has a negative compounding effect. And that can be really detrimental to somebody's retirement, especially when they experience that in those really early years. And so you'll see exact same scenario, just a couple year differential on when they retired. And Monica has about $95,000 in her portfolio. And these are the exact same returns. It's just when she experienced them relative to David. And that has a huge impact on your retirement and your lifestyle in retirement. And that's really where we have to come in and build your plan. And that's why we always encourage annual reviews. We make sure that we're at minimum. We're making sure that, hey, are we adjusting our lifestyle needs? Have we taken into account where the market's at? We really tailor this to your situation and when your retirement date is and what the market's doing. And there's so many factors that are constantly evolving and changing.
Oh, Jim, are you muted?
Yep.
People will have a portion of cash in their portfolio. And you might be wondering, like, why does my advisor keep 10% in cash, or why are they keeping 5% in cash? Well, the reason is if stuff goes down, you don't want to be eating your seed corn, right? You want to keep that cash to fund your lifestyle. And how much cash should you have? Individual question. I think it really, I hate to say it depends, but it depends. I mean, this is, I think, Shannon, Alissa, you're really good at this. I've worked with you with many clients. You're really good at doing the math. Like, you have all kinds of crazy modeling software and you can like dial it in. And, the other thing I hear is people say, well, as long as you beat the S&P 500, I'll hire you as a financial advisor. The problem with that is the risk that you are taking. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, historically, for the last 100 years, the S&P 500 has returned what, 7 years? Well, guess what? You're not going to be retired for 100 years. You're going to be retired for a block of time. And if you end up in Monica's situation, I would not want S&P 500 returns, right?
No, absolutely not. And what we would, Monica, if Monica was our client, we would make sure that in 2000, Monica did not sell anything in order to live off of. She would have had other pools of money to pull from, so that we didn't have this cumulative impact at the end of 20 years.
I got to tell you, and I've been through several down cycles, and there are people that panic, and this is the emotional component of this. They sell. And isn't it like for every 10 years, if you miss like the top 3 days, you have no return or something? I mean, some crazy, like, what is that figure? I don't know.
If you miss just the 10 best days, your total return over the course of, 10, 20 years can be cut significantly, almost in half in some cases, depending on, what 10-year time period. So it really matters staying the course. And, you'll hear us talk a lot today about financial plans. And of course, we can put a plan in place today, but we do not have crystal balls. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We didn't, know that 2008 was going to happen, for example. So that's why these plans they're living documents. We have to review them on a regular basis and make sure that we're adjusting so that we don't end up in a situation here like Monica.
Yeah. And it's really hard to predict, because I think some people like to think, well, if my political party's in power, things will be better. But I'm not sure there's not correlation between that, right? It's like, it's not, these things that you want to be correlated viscerally, like in your gut and in your heart. The Wall Street people are shockingly like cutthroat and objective. Like, the best people are the most objective people. And it's a little cold-hearted, but I guess those are the people you want to end up working with. I don't know. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, just click the subscribe button and the little bell. You'll get it'll pop up in your feed. These are posted once a week. So let's talk about the retirement equation.
Yeah. So now we know the risks. Well, what do we do about it? What are we supposed to do? How do we avoid and mitigate some of these risks? And the way I like to think about the kind of retirement problem, if you will, even though it's, a good thing at the end of the day, is There's always going to be different elements. There's different elements that we are completely out of our control. You know, what the market does, what Congress does. If they make changes to income tax law, to estate tax law. There was even talk for a while about completely removing the possibility of certain strategies like Roth conversions, for example. So while we don't have control over any of those aspects, there's certainly something that we need to monitor and make adjustments in the plan accordingly, but we can't really control those. The blue circles, I love these because these are the ones that we have some control over, right? You have some control over, to that question that we received earlier. You have some control over how long that you work. You have some control over how much your earnings are. And so you can certainly pull those levers. You know, a lot of people think of retirement as an all or nothing, but we've got a lot of people that also are, you know, maybe just transitioning, working instead of full-time, part-time, or transitioning to kind of one of their more passion project income streams. So those are things that you've got a lot of influence over, let's call it, maybe not control, but influence. So where we really want to focus our attention and time, especially today, is in these green circles. These are the areas where we have control over them. So we'll talk about spending and savings. A lot of the savings gets done in the accumulation phase, and of course, spending in the distribution phase, but we can pull levers in each one of those areas to kind of impact the overall plan. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about asset allocation and location, which is where we'll start. Now, asset allocation in and of itself is just simply the mix of investments that you have. So you might have some stocks, you might have some bonds, you might have some alternative investments, maybe real estate. And that is very important for someone's overall financial plan. But what we see too often is people getting too caught up and focusing on just that asset allocation, which quite frankly, we see some advisors doing as well. There's other factors at play that really matter. And one of those is asset location. And what asset location means is which account you have which investment in. So from a very high level, what we're looking at on the screen here is different types of accounts, different account registrations, as we call them, and the different tax implications during different phases, during contributions or during that accumulation phase, the treatment of the investment growth, and the treatment of the withdrawals. And what you can see here, just from looking at it, is there's a mix of some have benefits in certain phases and others have drawbacks in certain phases. So what this allows us is an opportunity to create a mix of these accounts in your portfolio to access the funds within these accounts at different times in order to get the best benefit. Where asset location comes into play is in this middle column in investment growth. This is a big factor when we're determining where to have something in your portfolio. Every well-rounded diversified portfolio is going to have some assets that are more conservative. So think like a bond, and some assets that are a little bit riskier, like a stock. Every portfolio is going to have income from different sources. Maybe you've got income that comes from a kickoff of capital gains or taxable interest versus income that comes from a municipal bond, which is tax exempt, right? So on that first line in your taxable investment accounts, these are going to be things like that you hold in your own individual name, your joint name, or a family trust, for example. The investment growth in those accounts is taxable as you earn it. So as you receive a dividend, as you receive a capital gains distribution, you have to pay tax on that every single year. Versus a municipal bond that might kick off some income for you, that income is tax exempt. So no taxes are due on that. So something like a municipal bond, you're going to want to hold that in a taxable account because then there's no tax consequences. Versus something like a stock, for example, that is going to kick off a capital gains distribution inside of a mutual fund, you're going to want to hold that perhaps in a tax deferred vehicle, like a retirement vehicle, so that you get that benefit during the growth phase.
Yeah, let me give you just an example, just to really give an example of what you're talking about, because I understand what you're talking about. I think a lot of people watching this, it might be like, huh? Here's the thing. If you have a tax-free bond in your own name, and let's say you get $100 in interest from that bond, you are not paying tax on that $100. If that bond is in an IRA and returns $100 in interest, when you take that distribution, you're going to have to pay tax on that $100. Mm-hmm. So you've just taken a tax exempt asset and turned it into a taxable asset. So a bit of a rookie mistake to have tax-free bonds in a retirement account. I mean, Could you make the use case? Yes, this is a good idea. But these are just sort of general rules. And, you know, if who knows if the person you're working with or you're not working with somebody, people just don't know this stuff, right? This is just kind of basic stuff for people who are knowledgeable like you, Shannon and Alissa. But this for the normal people out there, they just wouldn't even know.
Yeah, I just met with someone the other day and they had multiple annuities in IRAs, and not that that's entirely a bad thing. Sometimes that is circumstantially what makes sense for the client. But in this particular case, if you've got trust assets and don't have an annuity in your trust and you only have IRA annuities, annuities by design are for tax deferral. And if you stick them inside an already tax deferred account, you're not getting the benefit. It doesn't make entirely a lot of sense. And so it's just, those are things that we uncover all the time.
Yeah. And the backstory on that is a tax-free bond pays out at a lower interest rate, lower yield, because it's tax-free. So it has greater demand. And with an annuity, that tax deferral, there's a cost associated with that. I mean, when you run the numbers down, so it's kind of like wasting money a little bit, but I mean, again, this is just kind of basic financial hygiene. Does it matter 1 year over another? No. But do people get rich overnight? Some do. But you get rich over time. And if you're watching this, you know
we've actually dealt with a couple clients that have gotten rich overnight,
I know. But
yeah.
you can also get poor overnight if you get rich overnight, right? Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. We also want to make sure that we are diversifying even just within retirement assets. You know, there's a lot of conversation around traditional IRAs and 401ks versus Roth IRAs and 401ks. You know, you've got that upfront decision about, hey, do I want to make a contribution to my traditional IRA 401k so I get a tax deduction? But ultimately, you fast forward and you look out into the future, you're going to end up paying taxes, to your point, Jim, on all the growth that is experienced in that account, because when you take those funds out, they're taxed as ordinary income. You don't even get a capital gains benefit on that. And so you want to have a combination both during accumulation and also in retirement, because one of the really, really impactful kind of IRS rules for retirement is those required minimum distributions. So certain retirement accounts, the traditional and 401ks and IRAs, you've not paid taxes on any of the money that went in there. And the IRS is looking at those balances, kind of tapping their wrist saying, hey, we want you to pay the taxes on these. So you're forced to take out a specific amount starting at either age 73 or 75, depending on when you were born. And those are, you know, not optional. They are forced upon you whether you need the income or not. And they're based on your account balance. So we've got some flexibility there. We can do things like a Roth conversion, for example, where we take some of the money that's in a traditional IRA and we move it over to a Roth IRA. You pay taxes at the time of that conversion, but then the Roth IRA, we're able to think about asset allocation. We take more risk within that Roth IRA to get you some growth there, because when you take the money out of your Roth IRA, there's no taxes there. I kind of like to think of that Roth conversion as acceleration of taxes, paying it a little bit earlier. And what that does is it also gives us the opportunity to have a little bit of certainty about what the tax brackets are going to look like when we pay the taxes that are coming due. Because I don't know about, you know, you, but I'm not necessarily that confident that our tax brackets are going to be more beneficial in the future. So to be able to know right now what your taxes are going to be on that retirement income can be a really powerful lever to pull.
Yeah, and especially too, if you have a large estate, let's say you have a taxable estate over 13, 14 million. As an individual, of course, that's getting cut in half in 2026. If that IRA money is in your estate, your kids, let's say it goes to your kids, they have to pay death taxes on all that money, half of which is going to be paid in income tax in the future. You're better off doing a Roth conversion to get the value of that taxable estate down. So that's a double whammy. It's an income and a death tax benefit. By the way, when I use the term death taxes, I'm not using the political term death taxes. I'm talking about estate taxes, generation skipping taxes, and local state death taxes and local state inheritance taxes. So it's a much more broader term than the subset of estate tax. So next slide, or are we you still want to stay on this one?
I think let's go to the next slide, because I think the next slide addresses something that, you know, I think is always important to touch on when we talk about retirement, because for virtually everyone, you know, some some people don't participate in Social Security, but for virtually everyone, this is going to be a piece of that income puzzle in retirement. And we get asked quite frequently about the strategy of when to start taking Social Security, because as you're probably familiar, you have what's called a full retirement age. And this is going to be the age at which you can file to start taking your Social Security benefit. And that will be your full retirement benefit. Should you decide to wait, each year that you wait, in fact, every month that you wait to file past your full retirement age, you receive an increased benefit. And your benefit keeps increasing until you reach 70, at which point that's the maximum benefit that you're ever going to get. So absolutely, you need to file at 70, definitely not later than that. You have the option to file earlier as well. If I will say for most people, it doesn't make sense to file early because you do get a decreased benefit if you file early. But of course, Jim, you mentioned earlier, you know, some people are dealing with a situation where they might have a decreased life expectancy, or they may have a situation where we are, you know, like, let's remember Monica, where her portfolio was significantly stressed. And so it may be the right thing for her to start taking that Social Security early so that she's having to pull less out of her retirement accounts when things are down. But what this graphic shows us is where the break even, if you will, would be on when you'll have more cumulative total benefit by waiting, right? So if you start, the purple bars there show this particular example client starting their benefit at 62, they'd get about $2,500 a month. Versus if they waited to full retirement age, so it's the gray line, they'd get $3,600 a month. So by the time they are 77 years old, they would have had more cumulative income from waiting than if they would have started early. So if you're 62 years old, you expect to live past 77, you should definitely wait until your full retirement age. And then conversely, waiting past your full retirement age to 70, that's the blue line, that break even is about 81. So for most people, the average life expectancy, which of course is an average, some will live a lot less, some will live a lot longer, but for most people, the average life expectancy is in the mid 80s. So for most people, they're going to end up with cumulative more income by waiting to file Social Security than they would if they started early. But again, Jim, to your point, this is, it depends. This is just one part of this very complex puzzle. And so this needs to be evaluated as part of your overall portfolio and income plan.
Steve makes a comment, at age 75, I've come to realize that all the money in my traditional IRA belongs to the IRS. All my RMDs go to pay my taxes. There's an element of truth in that. A lot of times your RMD is your tax bill, right? So in a sense,
well, and there is there's another strategy called a qualified charitable distribution. So you could do that too, where you can send your RMD directly to a charity instead of the IRS. So there's other ways to help bring that income down, so you aren't paying as much taxes just because of your RMDs.
But this actually raises an interesting point. When you look at our total debt that the government has, what is it, 135% of GDP now or something? It's some crazy high number. That is unprecedented in human history, really. I mean, I think it was that high at the end of World War II. I mean, and by the way, if you're watching this and you're a rich person, rich people pay the taxes in this country, right? If you look at it, and I just think taxes are going up on everyone else. I mean, and there's so many tax breaks for rich people. Like, we have a lot of clients that might make $1 million, $10 million a year. There's so many ways that you can reduce your taxes lawfully. That's supported by both parties. I just think it's inevitable that taxes will be going up, and it's kind of depressing, but I mean, I think that's reality. So, all right, we'll get off that depressing topic. All right, let's talk about.
And Jim, this actually connects quite well with what you just said. It's the rich people, the people with the most money, that pay the most taxes. And this is also kind of one of those negative benefits of having money, having income. IRMA is, which you may or may not have heard of, is it stands for the Income Related Monthly Adjustment Amount. And what this amount is it's added to your Medicare premium amounts, your monthly Medicare premium amounts, should your income be over certain thresholds, which you can see here on the screen. So if you're a married couple filing jointly who's making, $300,000 of income between all of your sources, That would include your RMDs, right? So if you've got significant retirement assets, this could quite easily kick you into this bracket where you're paying IRMA. And you could be paying easily, you know, for a couple, an additional $7,000 to $8,000 a year just from this IRMA payment. And the other thing that I always want to mention when we talk about IRMA, especially in California where municipal bonds are so popular, IRMA, in order to see if you qualify to have this added to your Medicare as that surcharge, what they do is they look back 2 years prior to your income. And they look at your modified adjusted gross income. And your modified adjusted gross income is generally higher than your adjusted gross income. So it'll add back things like deductions for student loans, for example. But one of the biggest impacts is that tax exempt interest, which is not part of your AGI, is added when we're considering if you qualify for IRMA or not. So if you have a municipal bond portfolio that is kicking off income to you, that could very easily kick you into one of these ranges where you are subject to this increased cost. And this is just one of the ways that having a certain income level can hinder you in retirement, right? So that's why control is so important. We want to look at what income tax bracket you're falling in. It could cause you even to have higher capital gains taxes at the federal level if you've got certain income levels. Certain deductions, it can make those available to you or not available to you. So things get phased out, even down to how much of your Social Security is taxable at the federal level. All of these dominoes are connected, so we need to make sure that we are looking at the whole picture when we're thinking about your income.
Yeah. And, you know, you might be watching this and saying, well, wait a minute, if someone's making 500,000 single or married 750, yeah, maybe they're okay paying a little bit more. This is just one example of a whole bunch of taxes that when you start adding these up, it gets to be big. And by the way, just because something is taxable as income does not mean that it's really income. What do I mean by that? If you have an IRA and you take a minimum distribution, in my mind, I don't count that as income, right? It's not like I went and worked or I got, you know, some return on something. It's just money that's going from bucket A to bucket B, right? The tax deferred to the taxable bucket. So taxable income is not necessarily what a lot of people think income is. Like, I didn't have it last year, but I have it this year. No, the government just says, no, you got to we're taxing it and we're calling it income.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Man, this is really negative. Gosh, I can't.
All right, well, here's the positive, right? Here's how we
Yay.
structure things in order to make sure that we are alleviating some of these issues and kind of taking advantage of all of the opportunities that we have available to us. So you'll hear us talk a lot about kind of bucketing out different pools of income or pools of investments for different purposes. And when I look at where income comes from, that's also how I kind of view it, is as this pyramid. So the bottom in that blue section of stable spending, these are going to be, what are your essential needs? What are your housing needs? How do what do you need to cover your minimum healthcare, and just make sure that everything is taken care of for you. Ideally, in a perfect world, this income would come from guaranteed sources that you cannot outlive. Pensions used to be a really big part of this for a lot of people. And unfortunately, we're just not seeing as many people with pensions as we used to. But that guaranteed income also comes from Social Security. It can come from other sources as well that you can add to your own portfolio, right? So things like annuities. I think annuities get kind of a bad rap sometimes because, they've got a little bit of a bad reputation, but I like to think of annuities as medicine, right? I wouldn't necessarily recommend taking the same medicine for every person in every situation, but if it makes sense for your plan, if it's the right ailment that you've got and we can match it with the right medicine, there's definitely ways that we can add guaranteed income to someone's portfolio to make sure that there is that piece that you just simply cannot outlive in any situation.
So Shannon, I have a question for you. We had a mutual client who was a UC retiree and could have rolled over $1 million, but took the annuity instead and got a couple months of annuity payments and unfortunately passed away. And then that whole $1 million went away. Is that binary? Like, if I'm a UC employee, is it just the annuity or just the rollover of the pension, or can I split it 50-50 or do some type of,
Yeah, you can absolutely, you have the flexibility. So with your retirement monies, for example, you could have part of it roll over into an investment account that was built to grow. That's meant to be this legacy piece that we see up here on the top. And you could dedicate another portion to do one of these strategies like what we were just talking about, Jim, where you purchase your own annuity. You go out on the market, and we as independent financial advisors have access to every provider that's out there. We can help you evaluate which one is the right solution for you to create that income stream. And then most, if not all, of the options that we would recommend do have some sort of functionality where your heirs would benefit as well. So it's not a use it or lose it that, you know, God forbid you do start this income stream and 5 months into it, something, you know, unspeakable happens, that there is still that benefit that goes on to your heirs. So you have the flexibility 9 times out of 10 to make that decision for yourself. You just might need to have somebody help you evaluate those options.
A quick question. Anonymous asks, when are they, meaning the government, going to adjust the IRMA table for inflation? When does it get it, or does it get adjusted?
It does get adjusted regularly. So they'll generally put out that new table on an annual basis. Oftentimes they might not adjust it each year, but they'll announce what the IRMA levels are each year. I would anticipate that because we've seen so much inflation that we'll see an adjustment here soon. So the other thing to kind of keep in mind here is that next level of spending, which is kind of your variable, I like to call them lifestyle expenses, right? You retire, but you still want to travel, want to go see the grandkids, all of those things that you kind of put on the shelf. We want to make sure that you're able to do those things. So how do we pay for those? You'll see here that this lays out those expenses coming from cash, which is why we always, to your point, Jim, recommend having some amount of cash in a portfolio so that you have funds that are accessible to you. We do want to make sure, though, that that's the right level, because having too much cash is not necessarily good for the long term as well. But I think importantly, it's we need to talk about, where does that cash come from? And you'll see that kind of little shaded area there that says income distributed from. And I think this is a really exciting piece of the environment that we are in right now, because for so long, even on cash, you were not able to get any sort of return whatsoever. I just saw someone joking about, you know, they received the great news from their bank that their interest on their savings account had quadrupled, and it was now 0.04%. But we're finally in an environment, because of the interest rate hikes, where you're able to get some decent return on savings. There's vehicles out there right now that are paying north of 4% on cash balances, with taking, you know, virtually no risk. Of course, there's the risk of a bank failure that you've got to evaluate. And a lot of those products are structured so that you're always staying within the FDIC insurance limits. But there's now other sources of income available. We've talked about municipal bonds. This is a really strong area right now where you're able to not take on much risk at all, but you're able to clip coupons of maybe 5% on a municipal bond. Dividend paying equities are going to become, in my opinion, a lot more important in the environment going forward, because we're going to see a little bit of choppiness and volatility in the markets. Having those stocks in your portfolio that are more stable names, that have been around longer, that have the financial strength to be able to pay a dividend to their shareholders, all of these different sources, real estate investments, for example, that pay off income to you, that's how we build up this green part of the pyramid to make sure that you always have those living expenses available to you. And then when we look at the top, the legacy piece, these are the assets that we would hope, you know, barring some unforeseen event, we would hope that you don't have to tap these assets during your lifetime. So this is the part of the portfolio when we can take a little bit more risk, because the timeline on them is much more extended. There's some benefits of taking risk here as well, right? So if we put a stock in that has a high potential for capital appreciation, for example, that stock doubles from $100 to $200 per share. That $100 per share, if you were to utilize these funds during your lifetime, you have to pay taxes on that $100. If you hold that stock when you pass, those shares are then subject to what's called a step up in basis. So that capital gain essentially gets wiped away. Your heirs then would be able to access the full value of those funds without a step up, without capital gains. We also need to think about things like the tax that they would pay on retirement assets as well. And even just down to a really strong financial advisor is going to help you understand what the impact will be on your beneficiaries from a paperwork process. What is that? What is actually accessing the money inside of those legacy pieces of your portfolio look like for a client? And for their beneficiaries? Is there going to be a lot of paperwork? Is there going to be a probate, working closely with the estate planning attorney to make sure that things are titled? It all comes together again in those dominoes. So how do we manage these risks, right? This is essentially, I think, why everybody tunes in. And the simple answer is that there's a lot of different ways, and your situation will impact which one of these suggestions we would make in terms of managing the risks. We talked very specifically about sequence of returns risk. I think from my perspective, making sure that we've got diversified sources of income so that you're able to pull from different areas when things are down, uncorrelated investments to make sure that you've got some things that are up and some things that are down. To your point, Jim, you're not taking on S&P 500 only level of risk, and a dynamic spending strategy. What this means is being willing to change your level of spending based on the market environment, which this one is sometimes hard. And if we plan appropriately by having, certain cash cushions or buffer assets, we may not have to ask a client, for example, to spend a little bit less, but it's important to recognize that that is something that would help the longevity of a plan. Longevity risk, the ability to outlive your money. We talked about having guaranteed sources of income that are added to the portfolio. Thinking about a bucketed investment strategy so that we have pools of investments that have less risk in them that you can rely on in the near term. And then making sure that we're evaluating, to Alyssa's point earlier, at least annually, that we're looking at, exactly what's happening in the markets, how it's impacting your plan, and making sure that we're adjusting along the way. That's going to be important for every risk.
How frequently should you be evaluating? I mean, does it depend on market conditions? Does it depend on your life? I mean, what's because I get clients ask me, they go, Jim, I know you say I should review my estate plan every 3 to 5 years. That's kind of this general, generally a good idea. How often should you be reviewing your financial plan?
I would say at least annually. The other thing that becomes very important is life events, right? So if anything in your financial situation changes, whether that's an employment status change, whether that's, having a child, adopting a child, a marriage, a divorce, any of these potential life events that could impact your plan, of course, we're going to want to evaluate that right away. And there's also a lot more, I'll say, frequency during transition periods. So maybe it's once a year during accumulation phase or when you're well into retirement. But in that period, when you are nearing retirement and just entering retirement, we could be meeting with our clients once a quarter just to make sure that everything is on track, that we're changing income sources, that, we made the right budgeting decisions and that sort of thing. So again, it depends.
Yeah. And I'm thinking as you're talking, a lot of people who watch our webinars and a lot of our clients are business owners who sell their business. Mm-hmm. And I think too often people come to us after the deal's either done or the letter of intent is signed. It's like, wait a minute, you need to be visiting with your lawyer probably and your CPA and your team, maybe 6 or 7 years before you sell, 6 or 7 years. And there's an axiom in business. You should always be running your business as if you're going to sell it. It's just the best way to run a business. But exiting a business can be a very taxing endeavor, especially for Californians. A lot of Californians end up losing half of the sales, right? Half the sales price of a business, not uncommon to income and capital gains tax. So tough, and that kind of gets to your tax risk. But, to Steve's comment earlier about, I feel like my IRA is totally, it is totally owned by the government. You had these proposals and they were kind of kicked around when you have the mega Roth IRA, right? The billionaire with I think it's Peter Thiel's got 5 billion or something, whatever, in a Roth IRA because he, crazy. Right? I mean, that's just nuts. I could see a world where the government says you can only have so much in an IRA and the rest comes out as a minimum distribution even before you retire. And what's really important to understand, tax policy is fiscal policy. Whether and when something is taxable can change. It's not like some taking going back in time. So you can set up your IRA to do this and you can save based on the current law, but tax law can always change. And that's something that I think people kind of minimize. You know, taxes go up and down, and you say, well, wait a minute, I bought this asset 20 years ago thinking the taxes were going to be lower, and then you doubled the capital gains tax. Yeah, you still have to pay that, right? And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk about diversified tax status. What is that's the 401k versus the individual title?
Exactly. Yep. It's making sure that you've got investments that are treated differently in terms of, you know, upon withdrawal or the growth within them, because what that gives you is flexibility and control, right? So even down to things like if you have a long-term care event, for example, and you've got a lot of medical expenses that are not reimbursed, if those are above a certain threshold, those are deductible. So that might be a good year then to take the money to pay for those expenses out of your IRA, for example, because you have a deduction that could offset that distribution versus paying for those expenses out of a Roth IRA. But you can only make those decisions if you have a diversification of different types of accounts that are treated differently in different situations.
And these can be big numbers, right? I mean, when you're talking, they just compound over time. Okay, talk about long-term care insurance, and then we've got some questions here. I want to wrap it up within the hour, but talk about long-term care insurance.
So long-term care insurance is available to you should you ever have a long-term care event. And so ultimately, to Shannon's point, is where we pull those funds from in order to pay for a long-term care event. There is deductibility there. However, that's to a certain extent. And more often than not, you're taking after tax dollars. So just gross up your additional tax on top of that. So if your tax rate is 50%, add 50% on to whatever bill you have to get the same net after tax ability to pay X bill. So if you got 5,000 of bills, you're going to now have to take out, you know, 7,500 in order to pay that $5,000 bill after tax, right? So if you're using a long-term care insurance policy, it's entirely tax-free to you to use those funds to pay for those bills. And so not only that, you're leveraging the insurance company. So if you put, call it $100,000 into a long-term care insurance policy, they might give you $300,000 of benefits. So you've now gotten $200,000 on the house from the insurance company, and that $300,000 is going to come right back out to you tax-free for purposes of long-term care. So it's a really great way to transfer that risk and ideally eliminate the tax burden that can have a compounding effect like sequence of returns on your portfolio, especially when you're in those distribution years and needing income.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think long-term care insurance, I don't know if it's appropriately named, but it's almost like estate depletion insurance in the event of a long-term care event, because really what you're talking about is you put in $1, you get $3 back in coverage, and you're mitigating a risk. It's not necessarily paying for everything. You're mitigating that risk.
Right. And on the flip side of that, it's you're putting in $1, you're getting $3 out, but you're also not having to take, you know, $2 out to pay $1 in a bill because you're having to pay the tax first.
So we have a couple of questions. I do want to just be brief questions. To get income, I bought a house for my married California daughter. I'm in Maryland. I have a revocable trust. She pays rent to my trust. She lives in the house with her husband. If she's later divorced, is the house protected from main community property? I would say based on those facts, anonymous, she's not the owner of the house. You're the owner of the house. I don't really see a California court saying, you know, if the daughter is not an owner, I don't see that being an issue. After the death, if the house goes into the revocable trust of her California sister, will the separate property protection be continued? I would say, again, it's not legal advice. These are just my thoughts under those. Because she's never the owner, she has no community interest. Unless there's some other legal, you know, theory out there. Do you ever recommend reverse mortgages? Sometimes. My in-laws had a reverse mortgage. It depends. It's good for some people, not good for other people. I just got info that the cost basis step up to value may be affected by the types of trust you use. Your comment, yes. If the asset is includable in the gross estate of the person who died, the decedent, which is with the case with a living trust, a revocable living trust, then that property gets an adjusted cost basis. If it is not included in the estate of a decedent, it does not get an adjusted cost basis. So if it's in a B trust, You're probably not going to get an adjusted cost basis, right? Joy asks, what about the California and other states required long-term care?
We have a whole webinar.
Michigan, I'm sorry, it's Washington has it, California not yet, but it might be coming, and it's basically a crummy policy.
Yeah, it's a payroll tax. And if California, what they implement is anything like Washington, there will be a period where you can opt out of it by purchasing your own long-term care policy. But as Alissa mentioned, we did a whole separate webinar on this, so look for that on the YouTube. And
the question about the age cap, I heard it was 70. Isn't it 85 now? The age cap?
For
long-term care.
Oh. Yeah. It's certain insurance carriers will insure up to 81.
81.
So but it's generally never going to be cheaper than it is today to get that insurance.
And you know what your health is today.
Exactly. This is just a quick example that we put together of some of the planning that or type of planning that we do for clients. Going back to that mountaineering analogy, this is kind of us acting as the Sherpa to help get people down the mountain. So in this particular case, this couple is about to retire. You can see they've got hypothetical assets there. A lot of their assets are retirement assets, 5 million. And what we modeled for them is just showing the impact that only a few of these strategies can have. So what we did for them was a Roth conversion of $150,000 annually from retirement until their RMDs started. And then we also use that strategy that Alissa mentioned, the qualified charitable distribution, taking money directly out of their IRAs and giving it to a charity. Then it doesn't increase their AGI. It's not taxable as part of your RMD. So we're able to see in these next few reports the impact that it had for this hypothetical couple. The first is just on their portfolio assets through their life expectancies, which takes them out to their mid-90s, 95 years old. Just these two simple strategies, nothing else changed, of a Roth conversion and the qualified charitable distributions added about $3.2 million to their overall taxable estate. And again, that's just those few changes that we made. More impactful, I think, is the next report, which shows their income tax impact. I mentioned specifically that we recommended Roth conversions only for the window between when they stopped working, so their income goes down, their earned income goes down, and when their RMDs started, so that that income kicks back up. And you can see in the charts, essentially what we did with the recommended changes on the right is we just filled in that bar graph there, so that we essentially have them continuing to pay about the same amount of taxes that they've been paying on earned income. So it wouldn't be something that was necessarily felt too much for them. And what this does is that over the course of their lifetime, rather than paying $10.4 million in income taxes, just those few changes takes their total cumulative tax burden down to $7.6 million, or saving them, well over $2.5 million just in taxes from those two simple strategies that we implemented.
And this is an example of stuff that happens over time, not overnight. This is year over year. This is good habits. This is basic estate hygiene, where you have a more optimal result than if you're not paying attention, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then ultimately the impact is on their estate, right? So the left-hand side shows if we hadn't made any changes, what their projected estate values would be. The right-hand side shows with the Roth conversions and the charitable qualified distributions. You can see that we grew their estate. Remember, we increased their portfolio values by $3 million. So they do pay a little bit more estate tax in our hypothetical scenario, but their kids don't pay as much tax on the assets that they receive. Ultimately, $1 million goes to charity, and net to their heirs still increases by almost $3 million. And again, this is just isolating simple changes, but these are the types of impacts that very small changes can have over the course of your entire distribution phase.
Yeah, and really, I think it comes down to really mindfulness and paying that extra level of attention, rather than just being, it's too hard to think about. I just won't think about it.
Absolutely.
If you'd like to reach out to Shannon or Alissa, you can reach him at 805-312-7200, and you can reach us at 866-988-3956, myascentwealth.com. or CunninghamLegal.com. We have offices, Cunningham Legal has offices in Northern California and Southern California. So kind of Bay Area, North Bay, East Bay, and Capital Region, as well as the Ventura County, LA area. And we are having a live event. So if you're watching this next Thursday, we're actually having a live event in our Sacramento office. Kind of exciting. Very right down on just a few blocks from the state capitol, right? You're right where all they come up with all these great ways to tax you. 19 different ways to Sunday. So we'll be doing that next week, and you can go ahead and reserve on our website if that is of interest to you. And we will, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we will also have a webinar. Next webinar is May the 4th, which is, of course, Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you at noon. And this is a great webinar on the hidden traps in your living trust, because a lot of people, they don't know that there's a lot of stuff in there that is not good, right? And it not necessarily meaning that the provisions were bad when they were written, but they were written for old law, and that's very common, or they were written before somebody got married or somebody passed away or kid got divorced, whatever it is. And we'll be covering that in depth. So if you're watching this on YouTube, just keep watching, because we're going to roll to the next video. But it's very magical.